The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells. Chapter 11. In the Coach and Horses. Now, in order to clearly understand what had happened in the inn, it is necessary to go back to the moment when Mr. Marvel first came into view of Mr. Huxter's window. At that precise moment, Mr. Cuss and Mr. Bunting were in the parlour. They were seriously investigating the strange occurrences of the morning, and were, with Mr. Hall's permission, making a thorough examination of the Invisible Man's belongings. Jaffers had partially recovered from his fall, and had gone home in charge of his sympathetic friends. The stranger's scattered garments had been removed by Mrs. Hall, and the room tidied up. And on the table, under the window where the stranger had been wont to work, Cuss had hit almost at once on 3 big books in manuscript, labelled Diary. "Diary," said Cuss, putting the 3 books on the table. "Now, at any rate, we shall learn something." The vicar stood with his hands on the table. "Diary," repeated Cuss, sitting down, putting 2 volumes to support the 3rd, and opening it. No name on the flyleaf. Bother, cipher, and figures. The vicar came round to look over his shoulder. Cuss turned the pages over with a face suddenly disappointed. Oh, dear me, it's all cipher, Bunting." "There are no diagrams?" asked Mr. Bunting. "No illustrations throwing light?" "See for yourself," said Mr. Cuss. "Some of it's mathematical, and some of it's Russian, or some such language, to judge by the letters, and some of it's Greek. Now, the Greek I thought you—" "Of course," said Mr. Bunting, taking out and wiping his spectacles and feeling suddenly very uncomfortable, for he had no Greek left in his mind worth talking about. "Yes, the Greek, of course, may furnish a clue." "I'll find you a place. I'd rather glance through the volumes first," said Mr. Bunting, still wiping. "A general impression first, Cuss, and then, you know, we can go looking for clues." He coughed, put on his glasses, arranged them fastidiously, coughed again, and wished something would happen to avert the seemingly inevitable exposure. Then he took the volume Cuss handed him in a leisurely manner, and then something did happen. The door opened suddenly. Both gentlemen started violently, looked around, and were relieved to see a sporadically rosy face beneath a furry silk hat. "Tap?" asked the face, and stood staring. "No," said both gentlemen at once. "Over the other side, my man," said Mr. Bunting. "And please shut that door," said Mr. Cuss irritably. "All right," said the intruder, as it seemed in a low voice curiously different from the huskiness of its first inquiry. "Right you are," said the intruder in the former voice. "Stand clear." And he vanished and closed the door. "A sailor, I should judge," said Mr. Bunting. "Amusing fellows they are. Stand clear, indeed. A nautical term referring to his getting back out of the room, I suppose." "I dare say so," said Cuss. "My nerves are all loose today. It made me quite jump, the door opening like that." Mr. Bunting smiled as if he had not jumped. "And now," he said with a sigh, "these books." Someone sniffed as he did so. "One thing is indisputable," said Bunting, drawing a chair up next to that of Mr. Cuss. "There certainly have been very strange things happening at Iping during the last few days. Very strange. I cannot, of course, believe in this absurd invisibility story." "It's incredible," said Cuss, "incredible, but the fact remains that I certainly saw right down his sleeve." "But are you sure? Suppose a mirror, for instance. Hallucinations are so easily produced. I don't know if you've ever seen a really good conjurer." "I won't argue again," said Cuss. "We've thrashed that out, Bunting. And just now, there's these books. Ah, here's some of what I take to be Greek. Greek letters, certainly." He pointed to the middle of the page. Mr. Bunting flushed slightly and brought his face nearer, apparently finding some difficulty with his glasses. Suddenly he became aware of a strange feeling at the nape of his neck. He tried to raise his head and encountered an immovable resistance. The feeling was a curious pressure, the grip of a heavy, firm hand, and it bore his chin irresistibly to the table. "Don't move, little men," whispered a voice, "or I'll brain you both." Mr. Bunting looked into the face of Cuss, close to his own, and each saw a horrified reflection of his own sickly astonishment. "I'm sorry to handle you so roughly," said the voice, "but it's unavoidable. Since when did you learn to pry into an investigator's private memoranda?" said the voice, and two chins struck the table simultaneously, and two sets of teeth rattled. "Since when did you learn to invade the private rooms of a man in misfortune?" And the concussion was repeated. "Where have they put my clothes?" "Listen," said the voice. "The windows are fastened, and I've taken the key out of the door. I am a fairly strong man, and I have the poker handy, besides being invisible. There's not the slightest doubt that I could kill you both and get away quite easily if I wanted to. Do you understand? Very well. If I let you go, will you promise not to try any nonsense and do what I tell you?" The vicar and the doctor looked at one another, and the doctor pulled a face. "Yes," said Mr. Bunting, and the doctor repeated it. Then the pressure on the necks relaxed, and the doctor and the vicar sat up, both very red in the face and wriggling their heads. "Please keep sitting where you are," said the Invisible Man. "Here's the poker, you see." "When I came into this room," continued the Invisible Man, after presenting the poker to the tip of the nose of each of his visitors, "I did not expect to find it occupied, and I expected to find, in addition to my books of memoranda, an outfit of clothing. Where is it? No, don't rise, I can see it's gone. Now, just at present, though the days are quite warm enough for an invisible man to run about stark, the evenings are quite chilly. I want clothing and other accommodation, and I must also have those 3 books." Chapter 12. The Invisible Man loses his temper. It is unavoidable that at this point the narrative should break off again, for a certain very painful reason that will presently be apparent. While these things were going on in the parlour, and while Mr. Huxter was watching Mr. Marvel smoking his pipe against the gate not a dozen yards away, Mr. Hall and Teddy Henfrey were discussing in a state of cloudy puzzlement the one Iping topic. Suddenly there came a violent thud against the door of the parlour, a sharp cry, and then silence. "Hullo," said Teddy Henfrey. "Hullo," from the tap. Mr. Hall took things in slowly but surely. "That ain't right," he said, and came round from behind the bar towards the parlour door. He and Teddy approached the door together with intent faces. Their eyes considered. "Summat wrong," said Hall, and Henfrey nodded agreement. Whiffs of an unpleasant chemical odour met them. There was a muffled sound of conversation, very rapid and subdued. "You all right there?" asked Hall, rapping. The muttered conversation ceased abruptly. For a moment, silence. Then the conversation was resumed in hissing whispers. Then a sharp cry of, "No, no, you don't." There came a sudden motion and the oversetting of a chair. A brief struggle. Silence again. "What the deuce?" exclaimed Henfrey sotto voce. "You all right there?" asked Mr. Hall, sharply again. The vicar's voice answered with a curious, jerking intonation. Quite right. Please don't interrupt." "Odd," said Mr. Henfrey. "Odd," said Mr. Hall. "Says don't interrupt," said Henfrey. "I heard'n," said Hall. "And a sniff," said Henfrey. They remained listening. The conversation was rapid and subdued. "I can't," said Mr. Bunting, his voice rising. "I tell you, sir, I will not." "What was that?" asked Henfrey. "Says you winert. Weren't speaking to us, was he?" "Disgraceful," said Mr. Bunting within. "Disgraceful," said Mr. Henfrey. "I heard it distinct." "Who's that speaking now?" asked Henfrey. "Mr. Cuss, I suppose," said Hall. "Can you hear anything?" Silence. The sounds within indistinct and perplexing. "Sounds like throwing the tablecloth about," said Hall. Mrs. Hall appeared behind the bar. Hall made gestures of silence and invitation. This aroused Mrs. Hall's wifely opposition. "What you listening there for, Hall? Ain't you nothing better to do, busy day like this?" Hall tried to convey everything by grimaces and dumb show, but Mrs. Hall was obdurate. She raised her voice. So Hall and Henfrey, rather crestfallen, tiptoed back to the bar, gesticulating to explain to her. At first she refused to see anything in what they had heard at all. Then she insisted on Hall keeping silence while Henfrey told her his story. She was inclined to think the whole business nonsense. Perhaps they were just moving the furniture about. "I heard 'en say disgraceful. That I did," said Hall. "I heard that, Mrs. Hall," said Henfrey. "Like as not," began Mrs. Hall. "Shh," said Mr. Teddy Henfrey. "Didn't I hear the window?" "What window?" asked Mrs. Hall. "The parlour window," said Henfrey. Everyone stood listening intently. Mrs. Hall's eyes, directed straight before her, saw without seeing the brilliant oblong of the inn door, the road white and vivid, and Huxter's shop front blistering in the June sun. Abruptly Huxter's door opened, and Huxter appeared, eyes staring with excitement, arms gesticulating. "Yap!" cried Hunter. "Stop thief!" and he ran obliquely across the oblong towards the yard gates and vanished. Simultaneously came a tumult from the parlour and a sound of windows being closed. Hall, Henfrey, and the human contents of the tap rushed out at once pell-mell into the street. They saw someone whisk around the corner towards the road, and Mr. Huxter executing a complicated leap in the air that ended on his face and shoulder. Down the street, people were standing astonished or running towards them. Mr. Huxter was stunned. Henfrey stopped to discover this, but Hall and the two labourers from the tap rushed at once to the corner, shouting incoherent things, and saw Mr. Marvel vanishing by the corner of the church wall. They appeared to have jumped to the impossible conclusion that this was the invisible man suddenly become visible, and set off at once along the lane in pursuit. But Hall had hardly run a dozen yards before he gave a loud shout of astonishment and went flying headlong sideways, clutching one of the labourers and bringing him to the ground. He had been charged just as one charges a man at football. The second labourer came round in a circle, stared, and conceiving that Hall had tumbled over of his own accord, turned to resume the pursuit, only to be tripped by the ankle just as Huxter had been. Then, as the first labourer struggled to his feet, he was kicked sideways by a blow that might have felled an ox. As he went down, the rush from the direction of the village green came round the corner. The first to appear was the proprietor of the Coconut Shy, a burly man in blue jersey. He was astonished to see the lane empty save for three men sprawling absurdly on the ground. And then something happened to his rearmost foot, and he went headlong and rolled sideways just in time to graze the feet of his brother and partner, following headlong. The two were then kicked, knelt on, fallen over, and cursed by quite a number of over-hasty people. Now, when Hall and Henfrey and the labourers ran out of the house, Mrs. Hall, who had been disciplined by years of experience, remained in the bar next to the till. And suddenly the parlour door was opened and Mr. Cuss appeared, and without glancing at her, rushed at once down the steps round the corner. "Hold him," he cried. "Don't let him drop that parcel." He knew nothing of the existence of Marvel, for the invisible man had handed over the books and bundle in the yard. The face of Mr. Cuss was angry and resolute, but his costume was defective, a sort of limp white kilt that could only have passed muster in Greece. "Hold him," he bawled. "He's got my trousers, and every stitch of the vicar's clothes." "Tend to him in a minute," he cried to Henfrey as he passed the prostrate Huxter, and, coming round the corner to join the tumult, was promptly knocked off his feet into an indecorous sprawl. Somebody in full flight trod heavily on his finger. He yelled, struggled to regain his feet, was knocked against and thrown on all fours again, and became aware that he was involved not in a capture, but a rout. Everyone was running back to the village. He rose again and was hit severely behind the ear. He staggered and set off back to the Coach and Horses forthwith, leaping over the deserted Huxter, who was now sitting up on his way. Behind him, as he was halfway up the inn steps, he heard a sudden yell of rage, rising sharply out of the confusion of cries, and a sounding smack in someone's face. He recognised the voice as that of the invisible man, and the note was that of a man suddenly infuriated by a painful blow. In another moment, Mr. Cuss was back in the parlour. "He's coming back, Bunting," he said, rushing in. "Save yourself." Mr. Bunting was standing in the window, engaged in an attempt to clothe himself in the hearthrug and a West Surrey Gazette. "Who's coming?" he said, so startled that his costume narrowly escaped disintegration. "Invisible man," said Cuss, and rushed on to the window. "We'd better clear out from here. He's fighting mad. Mad!" In another moment he was out in the yard. "Good heavens!" said Mr. Bunting, hesitating between two horrible alternatives. He heard a frightful struggle in the passage of the inn, and his decision was made. He clambered out of the window, adjusted his costume hastily, and fled up the village as fast as his fat little legs would carry him. From the moment when the Invisible Man screamed with rage, and Mr. Bunting made his memorable flight up the village, it became impossible to give a consecutive account of affairs in Iping. Possibly the Invisible Man's original intention was simply to cover Marvel's retreat with the clothes and books, but his temper, at no time very good, seems to have gone completely at some chance blow, and forthwith he set to smiting and overthrowing for the mere satisfaction of hurting. You must figure the street full of running figures, of doors slamming and fights for hiding places. You must figure the tumult suddenly striking on the unstable equilibrium of old Fletcher's planks and two chairs with cataclysmic results. You must figure an appalled couple caught dismally in a swing. And then the whole tumultuous rush has passed, and the Iping street with its gourds and flags is deserted, save for the still raging unseen, and littered with coconuts, overthrown canvas screens, and the scattered stock in trade of a sweetstuff stall. Everywhere there is a sound of closing shutters and shoving bolts, and the only visible humanity is an occasional flitting eye under a raised eyebrow in the corner of a window pane. The Invisible Man amused himself for a little while by breaking all the windows in the Coach and Horses, and then he thrust a street lamp through the parlour window of Mrs. Gribble. He, it must have been, who cut the telegraph wire to Adderdean just beyond Higgins's cottage on the Adderdean road. And, after that, as his peculiar qualities allowed, he passed out of human perceptions altogether, and he was neither heard, seen, nor felt in Iping any more. He vanished absolutely. But it was the best part of 2 hours before any human being ventured out again into the desolation of an Iping street. End of chapter 12. Recorded in Nottingham, England, on the 5th of April 2006 by Alex Foster. www.alexfoster.me.uk. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer yourself, please visit www.librivox.org. Today's reading by Alex Foster. www.alexfoster.me.uk. The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells. Chapter 13. Mr. Marvel discusses his resignation. When the dust was gathering and Iping was just beginning to peep timorously forth again upon the shattered wreckage of its bank holiday, a short, thick-set man in a shabby silk hat was marching painfully through the twilight behind the beech woods on the road to Bramblehurst. He carried 3 books, bound together by some sort of ornamental elastic ligature, and a bundle wrapped in a blue tablecloth. His rubicund face expressed consternation and fatigue. He appeared to be in some sort of spasmodic hurry. He was accompanied by a voice other than his own, and ever and again he winced under the touch of unseen hands. "If you give me the slip again," said the voice, "if you attempt to give me the slip again—" "Lord," said Mr. Marvel, "that shoulder's a mass of bruises as it is." "On my honour," said the voice, "I will kill you." "I didn't try to give you the slip," said Marvel, in a voice that was not far remote from tears. "I swear I didn't. I didn't know the blessed turning, that was all. How the devil was I to know the blessed turning? As it is, I've been knocked about." "You'll get knocked about a great deal more if you don't mind," said the voice, and Mr. Marvel abruptly became silent. He blew out his cheeks, and his eyes were eloquent of despair. "It's bad enough to let those floundering yokels explode my little secret without your cutting off with my books. It's lucky for some of them they cut and ran when they did. Here am I. No one knew I was invisible. And now what am I to do?" "What am I to do?" asked Marvel sotto voce. "It's all about. It will be in the papers. Everybody will be looking for me, everyone on their guard." The voice broke off into vivid curses and ceased. The despair of Mr. Marvel's face deepened and his pace slackened. "Go on," said the voice. Mr. Marvel's face assumed a greyish tint between the ruddier patches. "Don't drop those books, stupid," said the voice sharply, overtaking him. "The fact is," said the voice, "I shall have to make use of you. You're a poor tool, but I must." "I'm a miserable tool," said Marvel. "You are," said the voice. "I'm the worst possible tool you could have," said Marvel. "I'm not strong," he said after a discouraging silence. "I'm not over-strong," he repeated. "No? And my heart's weak. That little business, I pulled it through, of course, but bless you, I could have dropped." "Well?" "I haven't the nerve and strength for the sort of thing you want." "I'll stimulate you." "I wish you wouldn't. I wouldn't like to mess up your plans, you know, but I might, out of sheer funk and misery." "You'd better not," said the voice with quiet emphasis. "I wish I was dead," said Marvel. "It ain't justice," he said. "You must admit, it seems to me I've a perfect right—" "Get on," said the voice. Mr. Marvel mended his pace, and for a time they went in silence again. "It's devilish hard," said Mr. Marvel. This was quite ineffectual. He tried another tack. "What do I make by it?" he began again, in a tone of unendurable wrong. "Oh, shut up," said the voice with sudden amazing vigour. "I'll see to you all right. You do what you're told. You'll do it all right. You're a fool and all that, but you'll do. I tell you, sir, I'm not the man for it. Respectfully, but it is so." "If you don't shut up, I shall twist your wrist again," said the Invisible Man. "I want to think." Presently 2 oblongs of yellow light appeared through the trees, and the square tower of a church loomed through the gloaming. "I shall keep my hand on your shoulder," said the voice, "all through the village. Go straight through, and try no foolery. It'll be the worse for you if you do." "I know that," sighed Mr. Marvel. "I know all that." The unhappy-looking figure in the obsolete silk hat passed up the street of the little village with his burdens, and vanished into the gathering darkness beyond the lights of the windows. Chapter 14. At Port Stowe. 10 o'clock the next morning found Mr. Marvel, unshaven, dirty and travel-stained, sitting with the books beside him and his hands deep in his pockets, looking very weary, nervous and uncomfortable, and inflating his cheeks at infrequent intervals on the bench outside a little inn on the outskirts of Port Stowe. Beside him were the books, but now they were tied with string. The bundle had been abandoned in the pine woods beyond Bramblehurst, in accordance with a change of plans in the Invisible Man. Mr. Marvel sat on the bench, and although no one took the slightest notice of him, his agitation remained at fever heat. His hands would go ever and again to his various pockets with a curious, nervous fumbling. When he had been sitting for the best part of an hour, however, an elderly mariner, carrying a newspaper, came out of the inn and sat down beside him. "Pleasant day," said the mariner. Mr. Marvel glanced about him, with something very like terror. "Very," he said. "Just seasonable weather for the time of year," said the mariner, taking no denial. "Quite," said Mr. Marvel. The mariner produced a toothpick and, saving his regard, was engrossed thereby for some minutes. His eyes, meanwhile, were at liberty to examine Mr. Marvel's dusty figure and the books beside him. As he had approached Mr. Marvel, he had heard a sound like the dropping of coins into a pocket. He was struck by the contrast of Mr. Marvel's appearance with this sudden suggestion of opulence. Thence his mind wandered back again to a topic that had taken a curiously firm hold of his imagination. "Books?" he said suddenly, noisily finishing with the toothpick. Mr. Marvel started and looked at them. "Oh yes," he said. "Yes, they're books." "There's some extraordinary things in books," said the mariner. "I believe you," said Mr. Marvel. "And some extraordinary things out of them," said the mariner. "True, likewise," said Mr. Marvel. He eyed his interlocutor and then glanced about him. "There's some extraordinary things in newspapers, for example," said the mariner. "There are." "In this newspaper," said the mariner. "Ah," said Mr. Marvel. "There's a story," said the mariner, fixing Mr. Marvel with an eye that was firm and deliberate. "There's a story about an invisible man, for instance." Mr. Marvel pulled his mouth askew and scratched his cheek and felt his ears glowing. "What will they be writing next?" he asked faintly. "Austria or America?" "Neither," said the mariner. "Here." "Lord," said Mr. Marvel, starting. "When I say here," said the mariner, to Mr. Marvel's intense relief, "I don't of course mean here in this place. I mean hereabouts." "An invisible man," said Mr. Marvel. "And what's he been up to?" "Everything," said the mariner, controlling Marvel with his eye and then amplifying. "Every blessed thing." "I ain't seen a paper these 4 days," said Marvel. "Iping's the place he started at," said the mariner. "Indeed," said Mr. Marvel. "He started there, and where he came from nobody don't seem to know. Here it is, peculiar story from Iping. And it says in this paper that the evidence is extraordinary strong. Extraordinary." "Lord," said Mr. Marvel. "But then it's an extraordinary story. There's a clergyman and a medical gent witnesses. Saw him all right and proper. At leastways didn't see him. He was staying, it says, at the Coach and Horses. And don't no one seem to be aware of his misfortune. Aware of his misfortune, it says, until in an altercation at the inn, it says, his bandages on his head was torn off. It was then observed that his head was invisible. Attempts were at once made to secure him, but casting off his garments, it says, he succeeded in escaping, but not until after a desperate struggle in which he had inflicted serious injuries, it says, on our worthy and able constable, Mr. J. A. Jaffers. Pretty straight story, eh? Names and everything." "Lord," said Mr. Marvel, looking nervously about him, trying to count the money in his pockets by his unaided sense of touch, and full of a strange and novel idea. "It sounds most astonishing." "Don't it? Extraordinary, I call it. Never heard tell of invisible men before, I haven't, but nowadays one hears such a lot of extraordinary things that—" "That all he did?" asked Marvel, trying to seem at his ease. "It's enough, ain't it?" said the mariner. "Didn't go back by any chance?" asked Marvel. "Just escaped and that's all, eh?" "All?" said the mariner. "Why, ain't it enough?" "Quite enough," said Marvel. "I should think it was enough," said the mariner. "I should think it was enough." "He didn't have any pals? It don't say he had any pals, does it?" asked Mr. Marvel, anxious. "Ain't one of a sort enough for you?" asked the mariner. "No, thank heaven, as one say. He didn't." He nodded his head slowly. "It makes me regular uncomfortable, the bare thought of that chap running about the country. He is at present at large, and from certain evidence it is supposed that he has took, I suppose they mean, the road to Port Stowe. You see, we're right in it. None of your American wonders this time, and just think of the things he might do. Where'd you be if he took a drop over and above and had a fancy to go for you? Supposing he wants to rob, who can prevent him? He can trespass, he can burgle, he could walk through the cordon of a policeman as easy as me, or you could give the slip to a blind man. Easier, for these here blind chaps hear uncommon sharp, I'm told. And wherever there was liquor, he fancied." "He's got a tremendous advantage, certainly," said Mr. Marvel. "And, well, you're right," said the mariner. He has. All this time, Mr. Marvel had been glancing about him intently, listening for faint footfalls, trying to detect imperceptible movements. He seemed on the point of some great resolution. He coughed behind his hand. He looked about him again, listened, bent towards the mariner, and lowered his voice. The fact of it is, I happen to know just a thing or two about this invisible man from private sources. Oh, said the mariner, interested. You? Yes, said Mr. Marvel. Me. Indeed, said the mariner. And may I ask? You will be astonished, said Mr. Marvel behind his hand. It's tremendous. Indeed, said the mariner. The fact is, began Mr. Marvel eagerly in a confidential undertone. Suddenly his expression changed marvellously. Ow! He said. He rose stiffly in his seat. His face was eloquent of physical suffering. Wow! He said. What's up? Said the mariner, concerned. Toothache, said Mr. Marvel, and put his hand to his ear. He caught hold of his books. I must be getting on, I think. He edged in a curious way along the seat away from his interlocutor. But you was just a-going to tell me about this here invisible man, protested the mariner. Mr. Marvel seemed to consult with himself. Hoax, said a voice. It's a hoax, said Mr. Marvel. But it's in the paper, said the mariner. Hoax all the same, said Marvel. I know the chap that started the lie. There ain't no invisible man whatsoever. Blimey. But how about this paper? Do you mean to say? Not a word of it, said Marvel stoutly. The mariner stared, paper in hand. Mr. Marvel jerkily faced about. Wait a bit, said the mariner, rising and speaking slowly. Do you mean to say? I do, said Mr. Marvel. Then why'd you let me go on and tell you all this blasted stuff then? What do you mean by letting a man make a fool of himself like that for, eh? Mr. Marvel blew out his cheeks. The mariner was suddenly very red indeed. He clenched his hands. I've been talking here this 10 minutes, he said, and you little pot-bellied, leathery-faced son of an old boot, couldn't have the elementary manners. Don't you come bandying words with me, said Mr. Marvel. Bandying words, I've a jolly good mind. Come up, said a voice, and Mr. Marvel was suddenly whirled about and started marching off in a curious spasmodic manner. You'd better move on, said the mariner. Who's moving on? Said Mr. Marvel. He was receding obliquely with a curious hurrying gait, with occasional violent jerks forward. Some way along the road he began a muttered monologue, protests and recriminations. Silly devil, said the mariner, legs wide apart, elbows akimbo, watching the receding figure. I'll show you, you silly ass. Hoaxing me. It's here, on the paper. Mr. Marvel retorted incoherently, and, receding, was hidden by a bend in the road, but the mariner still stood magnificent in the midst of the way until the approach of a butcher's cart dislodged him. Then he turned himself towards Portstow. Full of extraordinary asses, he said softly to himself. Just take me down a bit. That was his silly game. It's on the paper. And there was another extraordinary thing he was presently to hear that had happened quite close to him. And that was a vision of a fistful of money, no less, travelling without visible agency along by the wall at the corner of St. Michael's Lane. A brother mariner had seen this wonderful sight that very morning. He had snatched at the money forthwith and had been knocked headlong, and when he got to his feet the butterfly money had vanished. Our mariner was in the mood to believe anything, he declared, but that was a bit too stiff. Afterwards, however, he began to think things over. The story of the flying money was true, and all about that neighbourhood, even from the august London and Country Banking Company, from the tills of shops and inns, doors standing that sunny weather entirely open. Money had been quietly and dexterously making off that day in handfuls and rouleaux, floating quietly along by walls and shady places, dodging quickly from the approaching eyes of men. And it had, though no man had traced it, invariably ended its mysterious flight in the pocket of that agitated gentleman in the obsolete silk hat, sitting outside the little inn on the outskirts of Portstow. It was 10 days after, and indeed only when the Burdock story was already old, that the mariner collated these facts and began to understand how near he had been to the wonderful invisible man. Recorded in Nottingham, England on the 5th of April 2006 by Alex Foster. www.alexfoster.me.uk. Chapter 15. The Man Who Was Running. In the early evening time, Dr. Kemp was sitting in his study in the Belvedere on the hill overlooking Burdock. It was a pleasant little room with 3 windows, north, west and south, and bookshelves covered with books and scientific publications, and a broad writing table, and underneath the north window, a microscope, glass slips, minute instruments, some cultures, and scattered bottles of reagents. Dr. Kemp's solar lamp was lit, albeit the sky was still bright with the sunset light, and his blinds were up, because there was no offence of peering outsiders to require them pulled down. Dr. Kemp was a tall and slender young man, with flaxen hair and a moustache almost white, and the work he was upon would earn him, he hoped, the fellowship of the Royal Society, so highly did he think of it. And his eye, presently wandering from his work, caught the sunset blazing at the back of the hill that is over against his own. For a minute perhaps he sat, pen in mouth, admiring the rich golden colour above the crest, and then his attention was attracted by the little figure of a man, inky black, running over the hill brow towards him. He was a shortish little man, and he wore a high hat, and he was running so fast that his legs verily twinkled. "Another of those fools," said Dr. Kemp, "like that ass who ran into me this morning around a corner with 'Visible Man' a-coming, sir. I can't imagine what possesses people. One might think we were in the 13th century." He got up, went to the window, and stared at the dusky hillside and the dark little figure tearing down it. "He seems in a confounded hurry," said Dr. Kemp. "But he doesn't seem to be getting on. If his pockets were full of lead, he couldn't run heavier." "Spurted, sir," said Dr. Kemp. In another moment, the higher of the villas that had clambered up the hill from Burdock had occluded the running figure. He was visible again for a moment, and then again, 3 times between the 3 detached houses that came next, and then the terrace hid him. "Asses," said Dr. Kemp, swinging around on his heel and walking back to his writing table. But those who saw the fugitive nearer, and perceived the abject terror on his perspiring face, being themselves in the open roadway, did not share in the doctor's contempt. The man pounded, and as he ran he chinked like a well-filled purse that is tossed to and fro. He looked neither to the right nor the left, but his dilated eyes stared straight downhill to where the lamps were being lit and the people were crowded in the street, and his ill-shaped mouth fell apart, and a glary foam lay on his lips, and his breath came hoarse and noisy. All he passed stopped and began staring up the road and down, and interrogating one another with an inkling of discomfort for the reason of his haste. And then presently, far up the hill, a dog playing in the road yelped and ran under a gate, and as they still wondered something, a wind, a pad pad pad, a sound like a panting breathing, rushed by. People screamed, people sprang off the pavement. It passed in shouts, it passed by instinct down the hill. They were shouting in the street before Marvel was halfway there. They were bolting into houses and slamming the doors behind them, and with the news. He heard it and made one last desperate spurt. Fear came striding by, rushed ahead of him, and in a moment had seized the town. "The Invisible Man is coming! The Invisible Man!" Chapter 16. In the Jolly Cricketers. The Jolly Cricketers is just at the bottom of the hill where the tram lines begin. The barman leant his fat red arms on the counter and talked of horses with an anaemic cabman, while a black-bearded man in a grey snapped up biscuit and cheese, drank Burton, and conversed in American with a policeman off duty. "What's the shouting about?" said the anaemic cabman, going off at a tangent, trying to see up the hill over the dirty yellow blind in the low window of the inn. Somebody ran by outside. "Fire, perhaps," said the barman. Footsteps approached, running heavily. The door was pushed open violently, and Marvel, weeping and dishevelled, his hat gone, the neck of his coat torn open, rushed in, made a convulsive turn and attempted to shut the door. It was half held open by a strap. "Coming," he bawled, his voice shrieking with terror. "He's coming, the Invisible Man. After me, for God's sake, help, help, help." "Shut the doors," said the policeman. "Who's coming? What's the row?" He went to the door, released the strap, and it slammed. The American closed the other door. "Let me go inside," said Marvel, staggering and weeping, but still clutching the books. "Let me go inside. Lock me in somewhere. I tell you, he's after me. I gave him the slip. He said he'd kill me, and he will." "You're safe," said the man with the black beard. "The door's shut. What's it all about?" "Let me go inside," said Marvel, and shrieked aloud as a blow suddenly made the fastened door shiver, and was followed by a hurried rapping and a shouting outside. "Hello!" cried the policeman. "Who's there?" Mr. Marvel began to make frantic dives at panels that looked like doors. "He'll kill me. He's got a knife or something, for God's sake." "Here you are," said the barman. "Come in here." And he held up the flap of the bar. Mr. Marvel rushed behind the bar as the summons outside was repeated. "Don't open the door," he screamed. "Please don't open the door. Where shall I hide?" This Invisible Man, then?" asked the man with the black beard, with one hand behind him. "I guess it's about time we saw him." The window of the inn was suddenly smashed in, and there was a screaming and running to and fro in the street. The policeman had been standing on the settee, staring out, craning to see who was at the door. He got down with raised eyebrows. "It's that," he said. The barman stood in front of the bar parlour, which was now locked on Mr. Marvel, stared at the smashed window, and came around to the other two men. Everything was suddenly quiet. "I wish I had my truncheon," said the policeman, going irresolutely to the door. "Once we open, in he comes. There's no stopping him." "Don't you be in too much hurry about that door," said the anaemic cabman anxiously. "Draw the bolts," said the man with the black beard. "And if he comes—" He showed a revolver in his hand. "That won't do," said the policeman. "That's murder." "I know what country I'm in," said the man with the beard. "I'm going to let off at his legs. Draw the bolts." "Not with that blinking thing going off behind me," said the barman, craning over the blind. "Very well," said the man with the black beard, and stooping down, revolver ready, drew himself. Barman, cabman, and policeman faced about. "Come in," said the bearded man in an undertone, standing back and facing the unbolted doors with his pistol behind him. No one came in. The door remained closed. 5 minutes afterwards, when a second cabman pushed his head in cautiously, they were still waiting, and an anxious face peered out of the bar parlour and supplied information. "Are all the doors of the house shut?" asked Marvel. "He's going round, prowling round. He's as artful as the devil." "Good Lord," said the burly barman. "There's the back. Just watch them doors, I say." He looked about him helplessly. The bar parlour door slammed, and they heard the key turn. "There's the yard door and the private door. The yard door—" He rushed out of the bar. In a minute he reappeared with a carving knife in his hand. "The yard door was open," he said, and his fat underlip dropped. "He may be in the house now," said the first cabman. "He's not in the kitchen," said the barman. "There's 2 women there, and I've stabbed every inch of it with this little beef slicer, and they don't think he's come in. They haven't noticed." "Have you fastened it?" asked the first cabman. "I'm out of frocks," said the barman. The man with the beard replaced his revolver, and even as he did so the flap of the bar was shut down and the bolt clicked, and then with a tremendous thud the catch of the door snapped and the bar parlour door burst open. They heard Marvel squeal like a caught leveret, and forthwith they were clambering over the bar to his rescue. The bearded man's revolver cracked, and the looking-glass at the back of the parlour starred and came smashing and tinkling down. As the barman entered the room he saw Marvel, curiously crumpled up and struggling against the door that led to the yard and kitchen. The door flew open while the barman hesitated, and Marvel was dragged into the kitchen. There was a scream and a clatter of pans. Marvel, head down and lugging back obstinately, was forced to the kitchen door, and the bolts were drawn. Then the policeman, who had been trying to pass the barman, rushed in, followed by one of the cabmen, grabbed the wrist of the invisible hand that collared Marvel, was hit in the face and went reeling back. The door opened, and Marvel made a frantic effort to obtain a lodgment behind it. Then the cabman collared something. "I got him," said the cabman. The barman's red hands came clawing at the unseen. "Here he is," said the barman. Mr. Marvel, released, suddenly dropped to the ground and made an attempt to crawl behind the legs of the fighting men. The struggle blundered around the edge of the door. The voice of the Invisible Man was heard for the first time, yelling out sharply as the policeman trod on his foot. Then he cried out passionately and his fists flew round like flails. The cabman suddenly whooped and doubled up, kicked under the diaphragm. The door into the bar parlour from the kitchen slammed and covered Mr. Marvel's retreat. The men in the kitchen found themselves clutching at and struggling with empty air. "Where's he gone?" cried the man with the beard. "Out?" "This way," said the policeman, stepping into the yard and stopping. A piece of tile whizzed by his head and smashed among the crockery on the kitchen table. "I'll show him," shouted the man with the black beard, and suddenly a steel barrel shone over the policeman's shoulder, and 5 bullets had followed one another into the twilight whence the missile had come. As he fired, the man with the beard moved his hand in a horizontal curve so that his shots radiated out into the narrow yard like spokes from a wheel. A silence followed. "5 cartridges," said the man with the black beard. "That's the best of all. 4 aces and a joker. Get a lantern, someone, and come and feel about for his body." Chapter 17. Dr. Kemp's Visitor. Dr. Kemp had continued writing in his study until the shots aroused him. Crack, 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 they came, one after another. "Hello," said Dr. Kemp, putting his pen into his mouth again and listening. "Who's letting revolvers off in Burdock? What are the asses at now?" He went to the south window, threw it up, and leaning out stared down on the network of windows, beaded gas lamps and shops, with its black interstices of roof and yard that made up the town at night. "Looks like a crowd down the hill," he said, "by the cricketers," and remained watching. Thence his eyes wandered over the town to far away where the ship's lights shone and the pier glowed, a little illuminated faceted pavilion like a gem of yellow light. The moon in his first quarter hung over the westward hill, and the stars were clear and almost tropically bright. After 5 minutes, during which his mind had travelled into a remote speculation of social conditions of the future, and lost itself at last over the time dimension, Dr. Kemp roused himself with a sigh, pulled down the window again, and returned to his writing desk. It must have been about an hour after this that the front door bell rang. He had been writing slackly and with intervals of abstraction since the shots. He sat listening. He heard the servant answer the door and waited for her feet on the staircase, but she did not come. "Wonder what that was," said Dr. Kemp. He tried to resume his work, failed, got up, went downstairs from his study to the landing, rang, and called over the balustrade to the housemaid as she appeared in the hall below. "Was that a letter?" he asked. "Only a runaway ring, sir," she answered. "I'm restless tonight," he said to himself. He went back to his study and this time attacked his work resolutely. In a little while he was hard at work again, and the only sounds in the room were the ticking of the clock and the subdued shrillness of his quill, hurrying in the very centre of the circle of light his lampshade threw on his table. It was 2 o'clock before Dr. Kemp had finished his work for the night. He rose, yawned, and went downstairs to bed. He had already removed his coat and vest when he noticed that he was thirsty. He took a candle and went down to the dining room in search of a siphon and whiskey. Dr. Kemp's scientific pursuits have made him a very observant man, and as he recrossed the hall, he noticed a dark spot on the linoleum near the mat at the foot of the stairs. He went on upstairs, and then it suddenly occurred to him to ask himself what the spot on the linoleum might be. Apparently some subconscious element was at work. At any rate, he turned with his burden, went back to the hall, put down the siphon and whiskey, and, bending down, touched the spot. Without any great surprise, he found it had the stickiness and colour of drying blood. He took up his burden again and returned upstairs, looking about him and trying to account for the blood spot. On the landing he saw something and stopped astonished. The door handle of his own room was blood-stained. He looked at his own hand. It was quite clean, and then he remembered the door of his room had been open when he came down from his study, and that consequently he had not touched the handle at all. He went straight into his room, his face quite calm, perhaps a trifle more resolute than usual. His glance, wandering inquisitively, fell on the bed. On the counterpane was a mess of blood, and the sheet had been torn. He had not noticed this before because he had walked straight to the dressing table. On the further side, the bedclothes were depressed, as if someone had recently been sitting there. Then he had an odd impression that he heard a low voice say, "Good heavens, Kemp!" But Dr. Kemp was no believer in voices. He stood staring at the tumbled sheets. Was that really a voice? He looked about again, but noticed nothing further than the disordered and blood-stained bed. Then he distinctly heard a movement across the room, near the wash-hand stand. All men, however highly educated, retain some superstitious inklings. The feeling that is called eerie came upon him. He closed the door of the room, came forward to the dressing table and put down his burdens. Suddenly, with a start, he perceived a coiled and blood-stained bandage of linen rag hanging in mid-air between him and the wash-hand stand. He stared at this in amazement. It was an empty bandage, a bandage properly tied, but quite empty. He would have advanced to grasp it, but a touch arrested him, and a voice speaking quite close to him. "Kemp," said the voice. "Eh?" said Kemp with his mouth open. "Keep your nerve," said the voice. "I'm an invisible man." Kemp made no answer for a space, simply stared at the bandage. "Invisible man," he said. "I am an invisible man," repeated the voice. The story he had been active to ridicule only that morning rushed through Kemp's brain. He does not appear to have been either very much frightened or very greatly surprised at the moment. Realization came later. "I thought it was all a lie," he said. The thought uppermost in his mind was the reiterated arguments of the morning. "Have you a bandage on?" he asked. "Yes," said the invisible man. "Oh," said Kemp, and then roused himself. "I say," he said, "but this is nonsense. It's some trick." He stepped forward suddenly, and his hand, extended towards the bandage, met invisible fingers. He recoiled at the touch, and his colour changed. "Keep steady, Kemp, for God's sake. I want help badly. Stop." The hand gripped his arm. He struck at it. "Kemp," cried the voice. "Kemp, keep steady." And the grip tightened. A frantic desire to free himself took possession of Kemp. The hand of the bandaged arm gripped his shoulder, and he was suddenly tripped and flung backwards upon the bed. He opened his mouth to shout, and the corner of the sheet was thrust between his teeth. The invisible man had him down grimly, but his arms were free, and he struck and tried to kick savagely. "Listen to reason, will you?" said the invisible man, sticking to him in spite of a pounding in the ribs. "By heaven, you'll madden me in a minute." "Lie still, you fool," bawled the invisible man in Kemp's ear. Kemp struggled for another moment and then lay still. "If you shout, I'll smash your face," said the invisible man, relieving his mouth. "I'm an invisible man. It's no foolish and no magic. I really am an invisible man, and I want your help. I don't want to hurt you, but if you behave like a frantic rustic, I must. Don't you remember me, Kemp? Griffin of University College?" "Let me get up," said Kemp. "I'll stop where I am, and let me sit quiet for a minute." He sat up and felt his neck. "I am Griffin of University College, and I have made myself invisible. I am just an ordinary man, a man you have known, made invisible." "Griffin?" said Kemp. "Griffin," answered the voice. "A younger student than you were, almost an albino, 6 feet high and broad, with a pink and white face and red eyes, who won the medal for chemistry." "I am confused," said Kemp. "My brain is rioting. What has this to do with Griffin?" "I am Griffin." Kemp thought. "It's horrible," he said. "But what devilry must happen to make a man invisible?" "It's no devilry. It's a process, sane and intelligible enough." "It's horrible," said Kemp. "How on earth—" "It's horrible enough, but I am wounded and in pain and tired. Great God, Kemp, you're a man. Take it steady. Give me some food and drink, and let me sit down here." Kemp stared at the bandage as it moved across the room, then saw a basket chair dragged across the floor and come to rest near the bed. It creaked, and the seat was depressed by the quarter of an inch or so. He rubbed his eyes and felt his neck again. "This beats ghosts," he said, and laughed stupidly. "That's better. Thank heaven you're getting sensible." "Or silly," said Kemp, and knuckled his eyes. "Give me some whiskey. I'm near dead." "You didn't feel so." "Where are you? If I get up, shall I run into you?" "There. All right. Whiskey. Here. Where shall I give it to you?" The chair creaked, and Kemp felt the glass drawn away from him. He let go by an effort. His instinct was all against it. It came to rest, poised 20 inches above the front edge of the seat of the chair. He stared at it in infinite perplexity. This must be hypnotism. You have suggested you are invisible." "Nonsense," said the voice. "It's frantic. Listen to me. I demonstrated conclusively this morning," began Kemp, "that invisibility—" "Never mind what you've demonstrated. I'm starving," said the voice, "and the night is chilly to a man without clothes." "Food?" said Kemp. The tumbler of whiskey tilted itself. "Yes," said the Invisible Man, wrapping it down. "Have you a dressing gown?" Kemp made some exclamation in an undertone. He walked to a wardrobe and produced a robe of dingy scarlet. "This do?" he asked. It was taken from him. It hung limp for a moment in mid-air, fluttered weirdly, stood full and decorously buttoning itself, and sat down in his chair. "Drawers, socks, slippers would be a comfort," said the unseen curtly. "And food." "Anything. But this is the insanest thing I was ever in my life." He turned out his drawers for the articles, and then went downstairs to ransack his larder. He came back with some cold cutlets and bread, pulled up a light table and placed them before his guest. "Never mind knives," said his visitor, and a cutlet hung in mid-air with a sound of gnawing. "Invisible," said Kemp, and sat down on a bedroom chair. "I always like to get something about me before I eat," said the Invisible Man, with a full mouth, eating greedily. "Queer fancy." "I suppose that wrist is all right," said Kemp. "Trust me," said the Invisible Man. "Of all the strange and wonderful—" "Exactly. But it's odd I should blunder into your house to get my bandaging. My first stroke of luck. Anyhow, I meant to sleep in this house tonight. You must stand that. It's a filthy nuisance, my blood showing, isn't it? Quite a clot over there. Gets visible as it coagulates, you see. It's the only living tissue I've changed, and only for as long as I'm alive. I've been in the house 3 hours." "But how's it done?" began Kemp in a tone of exasperation. "Confound it, the whole business. It's unreasonable from beginning to end." "Quite reasonable," said the Invisible Man. "Perfectly reasonable." He reached over and secured the whiskey bottle. Kemp stared at the devouring dressing gown. A ray of candlelight penetrating a torn patch in the right shoulder made a triangle of light under the left ribs. "Where are the shots?" he asked. "How did the shooting begin?" "There was a real fool of a man, a sort of confederate of mine, curse him, who tried to steal my money. Has done so." "Is he invisible too?" "No." "Well, can't I have some more to eat before I tell you all that? I'm hungry, in pain, and you want me to tell stories." Kemp got up. "You didn't do any shooting?" he asked. "Not me," said his visitor. "Some fool I'd never seen fired at random. A lot of them got scared. They all got scared at me. Curse them. I say, I want more to eat than this, Kemp." "I'll see what there is to eat downstairs," said Kemp. "Not much, I'm afraid." After he had done eating and he had made a heavy meal, the Invisible Man demanded a cigar. He bit the end savagely before Kemp could find a knife, and cursed when the outer leaf loosened. It was strange to see him smoking. His mouth and throat, pharynx and nares, became visible as a sort of whirling smoke cast. "This blessed gift of smoking," he said, and puffed vigorously. "I am lucky to have fallen upon you, Kemp. You must help me. Fancy tumbling on you just now. I'm in a devilish scrape. I've been mad, I think, the things I've been through. But we will do things yet. Let me tell you—" He helped himself to more whiskey and soda. Kemp got up, looked about him, and fetched a glass from his spare room. "It's wild, but I suppose I may drink." "You haven't changed much, Kemp, these dozen years. You fair men don't. Cool and methodical, after the first collapse. I must tell you, we will work together." "But how was it all done?" said Kemp. "And how did you get like this?" "For God's sake, let me smoke in peace for a little while, and then I will begin to tell you." But the story was not told that night. The Invisible Man's wrist was growing painful. He was feverish, exhausted, and his mind came round to brood upon his chase down the hill and the struggle about the inn. He spoke in fragments of marvel. He smoked faster. His voice grew angry. Kemp tried to gather what he could. "He was afraid of me. I could see that he was afraid of me," said the Invisible Man many times over. "He meant to give me the slip. He was always casting about. What a fool I was. The cur. I should have killed him." "Where did you get the money?" asked Kemp abruptly. The Invisible Man was silent for a space. "I can't tell you tonight," he said. He groaned suddenly and leant forward, supporting his invisible head on invisible hands. "Kemp," he said, "I've had no sleep for near 3 days, except a couple of dozes an hour. I must sleep soon." "Well, have my room, have this room." "But how can I sleep? If I sleep, he will get away." "Oh, what does it matter?" "What's the shot wound?" asked Kemp abruptly. "Nothing. Scratch and blood." "Oh God, how I want sleep." "Why not?" The Invisible Man appeared to be regarding Kemp. "Because I've a particular objection to being caught by my fellow men," he said slowly. Kemp started. "Fool that I am," said the Invisible Man, striking the table smartly. "I've put the idea into your head." End of chapter 17. Read in Nottingham, England on the 5th of April 2006 by Alex Foster. www.alexfoster.me.uk. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells. Read for LibriVox by Alex Foster. www.alexfoster.me.uk. Chapter 18. The Invisible Man Sleeps. Exhausted and wounded as the Invisible Man was, he refused to accept Kemp's word that his freedom should be respected. He examined the 2 windows of the bedroom, drew up the blinds and opened the sashes to confirm Kemp's statement that a retreat by them would be possible. Outside the night was very quiet and still, and the new moon was settling over the down. Then he examined the keys of the bedroom and the 2 dressing-room doors to satisfy himself that these also could be made an assurance of freedom. Finally he expressed himself satisfied. He stood on the hearthrug and Kemp heard the sound of a yawn. "I'm sorry," said the Invisible Man, "if I cannot tell you all that I have done tonight, but I am worn out. It's grotesque, no doubt. It's horrible. But believe me, Kemp, in spite of your arguments of this morning, it is quite a possible thing. I have made a discovery. I meant to keep it to myself. I can't. I must have a partner. And you, we can do such things. But tomorrow. Now, Kemp, I feel as though I must sleep or perish." Kemp stood in the middle of the room, staring at the headless garment. "I suppose I must leave you," he said. "It's incredible. 3 things happening like this, overturning all my preconceptions, would make me insane. But it's real. Is there anything more that I can get you?" "Only bid me good night," said Griffin. "Good night," said Kemp, and shook an invisible hand. He walked sideways to the door. Suddenly, the dressing-gown walked quickly towards him. "Understand me," said the dressing-gown. "No attempts to hamper me or capture me or—" Kemp's face changed a little. "I thought I gave you my word," he said. Kemp closed the door softly behind him and the key was turned upon him forthwith. Then, as he stood with an expression of passive amazement on his face, the rapid feet came to the door of the dressing-room, and that too was locked. Kemp slapped his brow with his hand. Am I dreaming? Has the world gone mad, or have I? He laughed and put his hand to the locked door. "Barred out of my own bedroom by a flagrant absurdity," he said. He walked to the head of the staircase, turned and stared at the locked doors. "It's fact," he said. He put his fingers to his slightly bruised neck. "Undeniable fact." "But—" He shook his head hopelessly, turned and went downstairs. He lit the dining-room lamp, got out a cigar and began pacing the room, ejaculating. Now and then he would argue with himself. "Invisible," he said. "Is there such a thing as an invisible animal? In the sea, yes, thousands, millions. All the larvae, all the little nauplii and tonoras, all the microscopic things like jellyfish. In the sea there are more things invisible than visible. I never thought of that before. And in the ponds, too, all those little pond-life things, specks of colourless, translucent jelly. But in air? No. It can't be. But after all, why not? If a man was made of glass, he would still be visible. His meditation became profound. The bulk of 3 cigars had passed into the invisible or diffused as a white ash over the carpet before he spoke again. Then it was merely an exclamation. He turned aside, walked out of the room and went into his little consulting room and lit the gas there. It was a little room because Dr. Kemp did not live by practice, and in it were the day's newspapers. The morning's paper lay carelessly opened and thrown aside. He caught it up, turned it over, and read the account of a strange story from Iping that the mariner at Port Stowe had spelt over so painfully to Mr. Marvel. Kemp read it swiftly. "Wrapped up?" said Kemp. "Disguised? Hiding it? No one seems to have been aware of his misfortune? What the devil is his game?" He dropped the paper and his eye went seeking. "Ah," he said, and he caught up the St. James's Gazette, lying folded up as it had arrived. "Now we shall get at the truth," said Dr. Kemp. He rent the paper open. A couple of columns confronted him. "An entire village in Sussex goes mad," was the heading. "Good heavens," said Kemp, reading eagerly an incredulous account of the events in Iping of the previous afternoon that have already been described. Over the leaf, the report in the morning paper had been reprinted. He reread it. "Ran through the streets, striking left and right. Jaffers insensible, Mr. Huxter in great pain, still unable to describe what he saw. Painful humiliation, vicar. Woman ill with terror, windows smashed. This extraordinary story probably a fabrication. Too good not to print, cum grano." He dropped the paper and stared blankly in front of him. Probably a fabrication. He caught up the paper again and reread the whole business. But when does the tramp come in? Why the deuce was he chasing a tramp? He sat down abruptly on the surgical bench. "He's not only invisible," he said, "but he's mad, homicidal." When dawn came to mingle its pallor with the lamplight and cigar smoke of the dining room, Kemp was still pacing up and down, trying to grasp the incredible. He was altogether too excited to sleep. His servants, descending sleepily, discovered him, and were inclined to think that overstudy had worked this ill on him. He gave them extraordinary but quite explicit instructions to lay breakfast for 2 in the Belvedere study, and then to confine themselves to the basement and ground floor. Then he continued to pace the dining room until the morning's paper came. That had much to say and little to tell beyond the confirmation of the evening before, and a very badly written account of another remarkable tale from Port Burdock. This gave Kemp the essence of the happenings at the Jolly Cricketers, and the name of Marvel. "He has made me keep with him 24 hours, Marvel testified. Certain minor facts were added to the Iping story, notably the cutting of the village telegraph wire. But there was nothing to throw light on the connection between the Invisible Man and the tramp, for Mr. Marvel had supplied no information about the 3 books or the money with which he was lined. The incredulous tone had vanished, and a shoal of reporters and inquirers were already at work elaborating the matter. Kemp read every scrap of the report and sent his housemaid out to get every one of the morning papers she could. These also he devoured. "He is invisible," he said, "and it reads like rage growing to mania. The things he may do, and upstairs he's free as air. What on earth ought I to do? For instance, would it be a breach of faith if... No." He went to a little untidy desk in the corner and began a note. He tore this up half-written and wrote another. He read it over and considered it. Then he took an envelope and addressed it to Colonel Adye, Port Burdock. The Invisible Man awoke even as Kemp was doing this. He awoke in an evil temper, and Kemp, alert for every sound, heard his pattering feet rush suddenly across the bedroom overhead. Then a chair was flung over and the wash-hand-stand tumbler smashed. Kemp hurried upstairs and rapped eagerly. Chapter 19. Certain First Principles. "What's the matter?" asked Kemp when the Invisible Man admitted him. "Nothing," was the answer. "But confound it, the smash?" "Fit of temper," said the Invisible Man. "Forgot this arm and it's sore." "You're rather liable to that sort of thing." "I am." Kemp walked across the room and picked up the fragments of broken glass. "All the facts are out about you," said Kemp, standing up with the glass in his hand. "All that happened in Iping and down the hill. The world has become aware of its invisible citizen. But no one knows you are here." The Invisible Man swore. "The secret's out. I gather it was a secret. I don't know what your plans are, but of course I'm anxious to help you." The Invisible Man sat down on the bed. "There's breakfast upstairs," said Kemp, speaking as easily as possible, and he was delighted to find his strange guest rose willingly. Kemp led the way to the narrow staircase to the Belvedere. "Before we can do anything else," said Kemp, "I must understand a little more about this invisibility of yours." He had sat down after one nervous glance out of the window, with the air of a man who has talking to do. His doubts of the sanity of the entire business flashed and vanished again as he looked across to where Griffin sat at the breakfast table, a headless, handless dressing gown, wiping unseen lips on a miraculously held serviette. "It's simple enough and credible enough," said Griffin, putting the serviette aside and leaning the invisible head on an invisible hand. "No doubt to you, but—" Kemp laughed. "Well, yes, to me it seemed wonderful at first, no doubt, but now, great God! But we will do great things yet. I came on the stuff first at Chesilstowe." "Chesilstowe?" "I went there after I left London. You know I dropped medicine and took up physics? No? Well, I did. Light fascinated me." "Oh." "Optical density. The whole subject is a network of riddles, a network with solutions glimmering elusively through. And being but 22 and full of enthusiasm, I said, I will devote my life to this. This is worthwhile. You know what fools we are at 22. "Fools then or fools now," said Kemp. "As though knowing could be any satisfaction to a man. But I went to work like a slave, and I had hardly worked and thought about the matter 6 months before light came through one of the meshes, suddenly, blindingly. I found a general principle of pigments and refraction, a formula, a geometrical expression involving 4 dimensions. Fools, common men, even common mathematicians, do not know anything of what some general expression may mean to the student of molecular physics. In the books that tramp has hidden, there are marvels, miracles. But this was not a method, it was an idea that might lead to a method by which it would be possible, without changing any other property of matter, except in some instances colours, to lower the refractive index of a substance, solid or liquid, to that of air, so far as all practical purposes are concerned." "Phew," said Kemp, "that's odd. But still I don't quite see. I can understand that thereby you could spoil a valuable stone, but personal invisibility is a far cry." "Precisely," said Griffin. "But consider, visibility depends on the action of the visible bodies on light. Either a body absorbs light, or it reflects or refracts it, or it does all these things. If it neither reflects, nor refracts, nor absorbs light, it cannot of itself be visible. You see an opaque red box, for instance, because the colour absorbs some of the light and reflects the rest, all the red part of the light, to you. If it did not absorb any particular part of the light, but reflected it all, then it would be a shining white box, silver. A diamond box would neither absorb much of the light nor reflect much from the general surface, but just here and there, where the surfaces were favourable, the light would be reflected and refracted, so that you would get a brilliant appearance of flashing reflections and translucencies, a sort of skeleton of light. A glass box would not be so brilliant, not so clearly visible as a diamond box, because there would be less refraction and reflection. You see that? From certain points of view you could see quite clearly through it. Some kinds of glass would be more visible than others. A box of flint glass would be brighter than a box of ordinary window glass. A box of very thin common glass would be hard to see in a bad light, because it would absorb hardly any light and reflect very little. And if you put a sheet of common white glass in water, still more if you put it in some denser liquid than water, it would vanish almost altogether, because light passing from water to glass is only slightly reflected or indeed affected in any way. It is almost as invisible as a jet of coal gas or hydrogen is in air, and for precisely the same reason." "Yes," said Kemp, "that is pretty plain sailing. And here is another fact you will know to be true. If a sheet of glass is smashed, Kemp, and then beaten into a powder, it becomes much more visible while it is in the air. It becomes at least an opaque white powder. This is because the powdering multiplies the surfaces of the glass at which refraction and reflection occur. In the sheet of glass there are only 2 surfaces. In the powder the light is reflected or refracted by each grain it passes through, and very little gets right through the powder. But if the white powdered glass is put into water, it forthwith vanishes. The powdered glass and water have much the same refractive index. That is, the light undergoes very little refraction or reflection in passing from one to the other. You make the glass invisible by putting it into a liquid of nearly the same refractive index. A transparent thing becomes invisible if it is put in any medium of almost the same refractive index. And if you will consider only a second, you will see also that the powder of glass might be made to vanish in air if its refractive index could be made the same as that of air, for then there would be no refraction or reflection as the light passed from glass to air. Yes, yes, said Kemp, but a man's not powdered glass. No, said Griffin, he's more transparent. Nonsense. That from a doctor? How one forgets. Have you already forgotten your physics in 10 years? Just think of all the things that are transparent and seem not to be so. Paper, for instance, is made up of transparent fibres, and it is white and opaque only for the same reason that a powder of glass is white and opaque. Oil-white paper fill up the interstices between the particles with oil, so that there is no longer refraction or reflection except at the surfaces, and it becomes as transparent as glass. Are not only paper, but cotton fibre, linen fibre, wool fibre, woody fibre, and bone, Kemp, flesh, Kemp, hair, Kemp, nails and nerves, Kemps. In fact, the whole fabric of a man, except the red of his blood and the black pigment of hair, are all made up of transparent, colourless tissue. So little surfaces to make us visible one to the other. For the most part, the fibres of a living man are no more opaque than water. Great heavens, said Kemp, of course! Of course! I was thinking only last night of the sea larvae and all jellyfish. Now you have me, and all that I knew and had in mind a year after I left London, 6 years ago. But I kept it to myself. I had to do my work under frightful disadvantages. Oliver, my professor, was a scientific bounder, a journalist by instinct, a thief of ideas. He was always prying. And you know the knavish system of the scientific world. I simply would not publish and let him share my credit. I went on working. I got nearer and nearer to making my formula in an experiment, a reality. I told no living soul because I meant to flash my work upon the world with crushing effect and become famous at a blow. I took up the question of pigments to fill up certain gaps, and suddenly, but by design, not by accident, I made a discovery in physiology. Yes? You know the red colouring matter of blood? It can be made white, colourless, and remain with all the functions it has now. Kemp gave a cry of credulous amazement. The Invisible Man rose and began pacing the little study. You may well exclaim, I remember that night. It was late at night. In the daytime one was bothering with the gaping, silly students, and I worked then sometimes till dawn. It came suddenly, splendid and complete in my mind. I was alone, the laboratory was still, with the tall lights burning brightly and silently. In all my great moments I have been alone. One could make an animal, a tissue, transparent. One could make it invisible, all except the pigments. I could be invisible, I said, suddenly realizing what it meant to be an albino with such knowledge. It was overwhelming. I left the filtering I was doing and went and stared out of the great window at the stars. I could be invisible, I repeated. To do such a thing would be to transcend magic, and I beheld, unclouded by doubt, a magnificent vision of all that invisibility might mean to a man. The mystery, the power, the freedom. Drawbacks I saw none. You have only to think, and I, a shabby, poverty-struck, hemmed-in demonstrator, teaching fools in a provincial college, might suddenly become this. I ask you, Kemp, if you, anyone, I tell you, would have flung himself upon that research, and I worked 3 years, and every mountain of difficulty I toiled over showed another from its summit. The infinite details and the exasperation. A professor, a provincial professor, always prying. When are you going to publish this work of yours, was his everlasting question. And the students, the cramped means. 3 years I had of it. And after 3 years of secrecy and exasperation, I found that to complete it was impossible. Impossible. How? Asked Kemp. Money, said the Invisible Man, and went again to stare out of the window. He turned around abruptly. I robbed the old man. Robbed my father. The money was not his, and he shot himself. End of chapter 19. Recorded in Nottingham, England on the 9th of April 2006 by Alex Foster, www.alexfoster.me.uk. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer yourself, please visit www.librivox.org. Today's reading by Alex Foster, www.alexfoster.me.uk. The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells. Chapter 20. At the house in Great Portland Street. For a moment Kemp sat in silence, staring at the back of the headless figure at the window. Then he started, struck by a thought, rose, took the Invisible Man's arm, and turned him away from the outlook. "You're tired," he said, "and while I sit, you walk about. Have my chair." He placed himself between Griffin and the nearest window. For a space Griffin sat silent, then he resumed abruptly. "I had left the Chesilstowe cottage already," he said, "when that happened. It was last December. I had taken a room in London, a large unfurnished room with a big ill-managed lodging-house in a slum near Great Portland Street. The room was soon full of the appliances I had bought with his money, and the work was going on steadily, successfully, drawing near an end. I was like a man emerging from a thicket and suddenly coming on some unmeaning tragedy. I went to bury him. My mind was still on this research, and I did not lift a finger to save his character. I remember the funeral, the cheap hearse, the scant ceremony, the windy, frost-bitten hillside, and the old college friend of his who read the service over him, a shabby, black, bent old man with a snivelling cold. I remember walking back to the empty house, through the place that had once been a village and was now patched and tinkered by the jerry builders into the ugly likeness of a town. Every way the roads ran out at last into the desecrated fields, and ended in rubble heaps and rank wet weeds. I remember myself as a gaunt black figure, going along the slippery, shiny pavement, and the strange sense of detachment I felt from the squalid respectability, the sordid commercialism of the place. I did not feel a bit sorry for my father. He seemed to me to be the victim of his own foolish sentimentality. The current cant required my attendance at his funeral, but it was really not my affair. But going along the high street, my old life came back to me for a space, for I met the girl I had known 10 years since. Our eyes met. Something moved me to turn back and talk to her. She was a very ordinary person. It was all like a dream, that visit to the old places. I did not feel then that I was lonely, that I had come out from the world into a desolate place. I appreciated my loss of sympathy, but I put it down to the general inanity of things. Re-entering my room seemed like the recovery of reality. There were the things I knew and loved. There stood the apparatus, the experiments arranged and waiting. And now there was scarcely a difficulty left beyond the planning of details. I will tell you, Kemp, sooner or later, all the complicated processes. We need not go into that now. For the most part, saving certain gaps I chose to remember, they are written in cipher in those books the tramp has hidden. We must hunt him down. We must get those books again. But the essential phase was to place the transparent object whose refractive index was to be lowered between two radiating centers of a sort of ethereal vibration, of which I will tell you more fully later. No, not those Röntgen vibrations. I don't know these others of mine have been described. Yet they are obvious enough. I needed 2 little dynamos, and these I worked with a cheap gas engine. My first experiment was with a bit of white wool fabric. It was the strangest thing in the world to see it in the flicker of the flashes, soft and white, and then to watch it fade like a wreath of smoke and vanish. I could scarcely believe I had done it. I put my hand into the emptiness, and there was the thing, as solid as ever. I felt it awkwardly and threw it on the floor. I had a little trouble finding it again. And then came a curious experience. I heard a meow behind me, and turning, saw a lean white cat, very dirty, on the cistern cover outside the window. A thought came into my head. "Everything ready for you," I said, and I went to the window, opened it, and called softly. She came in, purring. The poor beast was starving, and I gave her some milk. All my food was in a cupboard in the corner of the room. After that she went smelling round the room, evidently with the idea of making herself at home. The invisible rag upset her a bit, You should have seen her spit at it. But I made her comfortable on the pillow of my truckle bed, and I gave her butter to get her to wash." "And you processed her?" "I processed her. But giving drugs to a cat is no joke, Kemp, and the process failed." "Failed?" "In two particulars. These were the claws and the pigment stuff. What is it? At the back of the eye in a cat, you know? Tapetum? Yes, the tapetum. It didn't go. After I'd given the stuff to bleach the blood and done certain other things to her, I gave the beast opium and put her and the little pillow she was sleeping on the apparatus. And after all the rest had faded and vanished, there remained two little ghosts of her eyes." "Odd." "I can't explain it. She was bandaged and clamped, of course, so I had her safe. But she woke while she was still misty and meowed dismally, and someone came knocking. It was an old woman from downstairs who suspected me of vivisecting, a drink-sodden old creature with only a white cat to care for in all the world. I whipped out some chloroform, applied it, and answered the door. "Did I hear a cat?" she asked. "My cat?" "Not here," said I very politely. She was a little doubtful, and tried to peer past me into the room, strange enough to her, no doubt, bare walls, uncurtained windows, truckle bed, with the gas engine vibrating and the seethe of the radiant points, and that faint ghastly stinging of chloroform in the air. She had to be satisfied at last and went away again. "How long did it take?" asked Kemp. 3 or 4 hours, the cat. The bones and sinews and the fat were the last to go, and the tips of the coloured hairs. And, as I say, the back part of the eye, tough, iridescent stuff that it is, wouldn't go at all. It was night outside long before the business was over, and nothing was to be seen but the dim eyes and the claws. I stopped the gas engine, felt for and stroked the beast which was still insensible, and then, being tired, left it sleeping on the invisible pillow, and went to bed. I found it hard to sleep. I lay awake thinking weak, aimless stuff, going over the experiment over and over again, or dreaming feverishly of things growing misty and vanishing about me until everything, the ground I stood on, vanished. And so I came to that sickly falling nightmare one gets. About 2, the cat began meowing about the room. I tried to hush it by talking to it, and then I decided to turn it out. I remember the shock when I had striking a light. They were just the round eyes shining green, and nothing round them. I would have given it milk, but I hadn't any. It wouldn't be quiet, it just sat down and meowed at the door. I tried to catch it with the idea of putting it out of the window, but it wouldn't be caught. It vanished. Then it began meowing in different parts of the room. At last I opened the window and made a bustle. I suppose it went out at last. I never saw any more of it. Then, heaven knows why, I fell thinking of my father's funeral again, and the dismal windy hillside until the day had come. I found sleeping was hopeless, and, locking my door after me, wandered out into the morning streets. "You don't mean to say there's an invisible cat at large?" said Kemp. "If it hasn't been killed," said the invisible man. "Why not?" "Why not?" said Kemp. I didn't mean to interrupt. "It's very probably been killed. It was alive 4 days afterwards. I know, and down a grating in Great Titchfield Street, because I saw a crowd round the place trying to see whence the meowing came." He was silent for the best part of a minute. Then he resumed abruptly. "I remember that morning before the change very vividly. I must have gone up Great Portland Street. I remember the barracks in Albany Street and the horse soldiers coming out, and at last I found the summit of Primrose Hill. It was a sunny day in January, one of those sunny, frosty days that come before the snow this year. My weary brain tried to formulate the position, to plot out a plan of action. I was surprised to find, now that the prize was within my grasp, how inconclusive its attainment seemed. As a matter of fact, I was worked out. The intense stress of nearly 4 years' continuous work left me incapable of any strength of feeling. I was apathetic, and I tried in vain to recover the enthusiasm of my first inquiries, the passion of discovery that had enabled me to compass even the downfall of my father's grey hairs. Nothing seemed to matter. I saw pretty clearly this was a transient mood due to overwork and want of sleep, and that either by drugs or rest it would be possible to recover my energies. All I could think clearly was that the thing had to be carried through. The fixed idea still ruled me, and soon, for the money I had was almost exhausted. I looked about me at the hillside with children playing and girls watching them, and tried to think of all the fantastic advantages an invisible man would have in the world. After a time I crawled home, took some food and a strong dose of strychnine, and went to sleep in my clothes on my unmade bed. Strychnine is a grand tonic, Kemp, to take the flabbiness out of a man. It's the devil, said Kemp. It's the Paleolithic in a bottle. I awoke, vastly invigorated and rather irritable. You know? I know the stuff. And there was someone rapping at the door. It was my landlord, with threats and inquiries, an old Polish Jew in a long grey coat and greasy slippers. I had been tormenting a cat in the night, he was sure. The old woman's tongue had been busy. He insisted on knowing all about it. The laws in this country against vivisection were very severe. He might be liable. I denied the cat. Then the vibration of the little gas engine could be felt all over the house, he said. That was true, certainly. He edged around me into the room, peering about over his German silver spectacles, and a sudden dread came into my mind that he might carry away something of my secret. I tried to keep between him and the concentrating apparatus I had arranged, and that only made him more curious. What was I doing? Why was I always alone and secretive? Was it legal? Was it dangerous? I paid nothing but the usual rent. His had always been a most respectable house in a disreputable neighbourhood. Suddenly my temper gave way. I told him to get out. He began to protest, to jabber of his right of entry. In a moment I had him by the collar, something ripped, and he went spinning out into his own passage. I slammed and locked the door and sat down quivering. He made a fuss outside, which I disregarded, and after a time he went away. But this brought matters to a crisis. I did not know what he would do, nor even what he had power to do. To move to fresh apartments would have meant delay. Altogether I had barely £20 left in the world, for the most part in a bank, and I could not afford that. Vanish? It was irresistible. Then there would be an inquiry, the sacking of my room. At the thought of the possibility of my work being exposed or interrupted at its very climax, I became angry and active. I hurried out with my 3 books of notes, my cheque-book, the tramp has them now, and directed them from the nearest post office to a house of call for letters and parcels in Great Portland Street. I tried to go out noiselessly. Coming in, I found my landlord going quietly upstairs. He had heard the door close, I suppose. You would have laughed to see him jump aside on the landing as I came tearing up after him. He glared at me as I went by him, and I made the house quiver with my slamming of the door. I heard him come shuffling up to my floor, hesitate, and go down. I set to work upon my preparations forthwith. It was all done that evening and night. While I was still sitting under the sickly, drowsy influence of the drugs that decolorize blood, there came a repeated knocking at the door. It ceased. Footsteps went away and returned, and the knocking was resumed. There was an attempt to push something under the door, a blue paper. Then, in a fit of irritation, I arose and went and flung the door wide open. "Now then," I said. It was my landlord with a notice of ejectment or something. He held it out to me, saw something odd about my hands, I expected, and lifted his eyes to my face. For a moment he gaped. Then he gave a sort of inarticulate cry, dropped candle and writ together, and went blundering down the dark passage to the stairs. I shut the door, locked it, and went to the looking-glass. Then I understood his terror. My face was white, like white stone. But it was all horrible. I had not expected the suffering. A night of racking anguish, sickness and fainting. I set my teeth, though my skin was presently afire, all my body afire, but I lay there like grim death. I understood now how it was that the cat had howled until I chloroformed it. Lucky it was I lived alone and untended in my room. There were times when I sobbed and groaned and talked, but I stuck to it. I became insensible and woke languid in the darkness. The pain had passed. I thought I was killing myself, and I did not care. I shall never forget that dawn, and the strange horror of seeing that my hands had become as clouded glass, and watching them grow clearer and thinner as the day went by, until at last I could see the sickly disorder of my room through them, though I closed my transparent eyelids. My limbs became glassy. The bones and arteries faded, vanished, and the little white nerves went last. I gritted my teeth and stayed there to the end. At last only the dead tips of the fingernails remained, pallid and white, and the brown stain of some acid upon my fingers. I struggled up. At first I was as incapable as a swathed infant, stepping with limbs I could not see. I was weak and very hungry. I went and stared at nothing in my shaving glass, at nothing save where an attenuated pigment still remained behind the retina of my eyes, fainter than mist. I had to hang onto the table and press my forehead against the glass. It was only by frantic effort of will that I dragged myself back to the apparatus and completed the process. I slept during the forenoon, pulling the sheet over my eyes to shut out the light, and about midday I was awakened again by a knocking. My strength had returned. I sat up and listened and heard a whispering. I sprang to my feet and, as noiselessly as possible, began to detach the connections of my apparatus and to distribute it about the room so as to destroy the suggestions of its arrangement. Presently the knocking was renewed and voices called, first my landlord's and then 2 others. To gain time, I answered them. The invisible rag and pillow came to hand, and I opened the window and pitched them out onto the cistern cover. As the window opened, a heavy crash came at the door. Someone had charged it with the idea of smashing the lock, but the stout bolts I had screwed up some days before stopped him. That startled me, made me angry. I began to tremble and do things hurriedly. I tossed together some loose paper, straw, packing paper and so forth in the middle of the room and turned on the gas. Heavy blows began to rain upon the door. I could not find the matches. I beat my hands on the wall with rage. I turned the gas again, stepped out of the window on the cistern cover, very softly lowered the sash and sat down, secure and invisible but quivering with anger to watch events. They split a panel I saw, and in another moment they had broken away the staples of the bolts and stood in the open doorway. It was the landlord and his 2 stepsons, sturdy young men of 3 or 4 and 20. Behind them fluttered the old hag of a woman from downstairs. You may imagine their astonishment to find the room empty. One of the younger men rushed to the window at once, flung it up and stared out. His staring eyes and thick-lipped, bearded face came a foot from my face. I was half-minded to hit his silly countenance, but I arrested my doubled fist. He stared right through me. So did the others as they joined him. The old man went and peered under the bed, and they all made a rush for the cupboard. They had to argue about it in length in Yiddish and Cockney English. They concluded I had not answered them, that their imagination had deceived them. A feeling of extraordinary elation took the place of my anger as I sat outside the window and watched these 4 people, for the old lady came in, glancing suspiciously about like a cat, trying to understand the riddle of my behaviour. The old man, so far as I could understand his patois, agreed with the old lady that I was a vivisectionist. The sons protested in garbled English that I was an electrician and appealed to the dynamos and radiators. They were all nervous about my arrival, although I found subsequently that they had bolted the front door. The old lady peered into the cupboard and under the bed, and one of the young men pushed up the register and stared up the chimney. One of my fellow lodgers, a costermonger who shared the opposite room with a butcher, appeared on the landing, and he was called in and told incoherent things. It occurred to me that the radiators, if they fell into the hands of some acute, well-educated person, would give me away too much, and watching my opportunity, I came into the room and tilted one of the little dynamos off its fellow on which it was standing, and smashed both apparatus. Then, while they were trying to explain the smash, I dodged out of the room and went softly downstairs. I went into one of the sitting rooms and waited until they came down, still speculating and argumentative, all a little disappointed at finding no horrors, and all a little puzzled how they stood legally towards me. Then I slipped up again with a box of matches, fired my heap of paper and rubbish, put the chairs and bedding thereby, led the gas to the affair by the means of an india-rubber tube, and waving a farewell to the room, left it for the last time. "You fired the house?" exclaimed Kemp. "Fired the house. It was the only way to cover my trail, and no doubt it was insured. I slipped the bolts of the front door quietly and went out into the street. I was invisible, and I was only just beginning to realize the extraordinary advantage my invisibility gave me. My head was already teeming with plans of all the wild and wonderful things I now had impunity to do. End of chapter 20. Recorded in Nottingham, England on the 9th of April 2006 by Alex Foster. www.alexfoster.me.uk.